हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम पढ़ेंगे एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 11। तो कल हम देख रहे थे थीम 2, तो आज उसी को हम कंटिन्यू करेंगे। तो लास्ट क्लास हमने यहाँ तक देख लिया था, मतलब इसका इंट्रोडक्शन कर लिया था। आज यहाँ से हम शुरू करेंगे। Two powerful empires ruled over most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East in the period between the birth of Christ and the early part of the 17th century, say down to the 630s. The two empires were the Rome and Iran. The Romans and Iranians were rivals and fought against each other for much of their history. Their empires lay next to each other, separated only by a narrow strip of land that ran along the river Euphrates. In this chapter, we shall be looking at the Roman Empire, but we shall also refer in passing to Rome's rival, Iran. If you look at the map, you will see that the continents of Europe and Africa are separated by a sea that stretches all the way from Spain in the west to Syria in the east. This sea is called the Mediterranean, and it was the heart of Rome's empire. Rome dominated the Mediterranean, and all the regions around that sea in both empires were formed by two great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube. To the south by the huge expanse of desert called the Sahara. This vast stretch of territory was the Roman Empire. Iran controlled the whole area south of the Caspian Sea down to eastern Arabia and sometimes large parts of Afghanistan as well. These two superpowers had divided up most of the world that the Chinese called Ta Chin, Great Chin, roughly the West. The early empire. The Roman Empire can broadly be divided into two phases, early and the late, divided by the 3rd century as a sort of historical watershed between them. In other words, the whole period down to the main part of the 3rd century can be called the early empire, and the period after that, the late empire. A major difference between the two superpowers and their respective empires was that the Roman Empire was culturally much more diverse than that of Iran. The Parthians and later the Sasanians, the dynasties that ruled Iran in this period, ruled over a population that was largely Iranian. The Roman Empire, by contrast, was a mosaic of territories and cultures that were chiefly bound together in a common system of purposes of government. Many languages were spoken in the empire, but for the purposes of administration, Latin and Greek were the most widely used, indeed the only languages. The upper classes of the East spoke and wrote in Greek, those of the West in Latin, and the boundary between these broad languages areas ran somewhere across the middle of the Mediterranean, between the African provinces of Tripolitania, which was Latin speaking, and Cilicia, Greek speaking. All those who lived in the empire were subjects of a single ruler, the emperor, regardless of where they lived and what language they spoke. The regime established by Augustus, the first emperor in 27 BCE, was called the Principate. Although Augustus was the sole ruler and the only real source of authority, the fiction was kept alive that he was actually only the leading citizen, princeps in Latin, not the absolute ruler. This was done out of respect for the Senate, the body which had controlled Rome earlier, in the days when it was republic. The republic was the name for a regime in which the reality of power lay with the Senate, a body dominated by a small group of wealthy families who formed the nobility. In practice, the republic represented the government of the nobility, exercised through the body called the Senate. The republic lasted from 509 BCE to 27 BC, when it was overthrown by Octavian, the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar, who later changed his name to Augustus. Membership of the Senate was for life and wealth, and office holding counted for more than birth. The Senate had existed in Rome for centuries and had been and remained a body representing the aristocracy, that is, the wealthiest family of Roman and later Italian descent, mainly landowners. Most of the Roman histories that survive in Greek and Latin were written by people from a senatorial background. From this, it is clear that emperors were judged by how they behaved towards the Senate. The worst emperors were those who were hostile to the senatorial class, behaving with suspicion or brutality and violence. Many senators earned to go back to the days of the Republic, but most must have realized that this was impossible. Next to the emperor and the senate, the other key institution of imperial rule was the army. Unlike the army of its rival in the Persian Empire, which was conscripted army, the Romans had a paid professional army where soldiers had to put in a minimum of 25 years of service. A conscripted army is one which is forcibly recruited. Military service is compulsory for certain groups or categories of the population. Indeed, the existence of a paid army was a distinctive feature of the Roman Empire. The army was the largest single organized body in the empire, 600,000 by the 4th century, and it certainly had the power to determine the fate of emperors. The soldiers would constantly agitate for better wages and service conditions. These agitations often took the form of mutinies. If the soldiers felt let down by their generals or even the emperor, again our picture of the Roman army depends largely on the way they were portrayed by historians with senatorial sympathies. The Senate hated and feared the army because it was a source of often unpredictable violence, especially in the tense conditions of the 3rd century when government was forced to tax more heavily to pay for its mounting military expenditures. To sum up, the emperors, the aristocracy, and the army were the three main players in the political history of the empire. The success of individual empires depended on their control of the army, and when the armies were divided, the result usually was civil war. Civil war refers to armed struggle for power within the same country in contrast to conflicts between different countries. Except for one notorious year, 69 CE, when four emperors mounted the throne in quick succession, the first 2 centuries were, on whole, free from civil war and, in this sense, relatively stable. Succession to the throne was based as far as possible on family descent, either natural or adoptive, and even the army was strongly wedded to this principle. For example, Tiberius, the second in the long line of Roman emperors, was not the natural son of Augustus, the ruler who founded the Principate, but Augustus adopted him to ensure a smooth transition. External warfare was also much less common in the first 2 centuries. The empire inherited by Tiberius from Augustus was already so vast that further expansion was felt to be unnecessary. In fact, the Augustan age is remembered for the peace it ushered in after decades of internal strife and centuries of military conquest. The only major campaign of expansion in the early empire was Trajan's fruitless occupation of territory across the Euphrates in the year 113 to 17 CE, abandoned by his successor. The Emperor Trajan's dream, a conquest of India. Then, after a winter in Antioch marked by a great earthquake, in 1616 Trajan marched down the Euphrates to Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, and then to the head of the Persian Gulf. There, the historian Caesius Dio describes him looking longingly at a merchant ship setting off for India and wishing that he were as young as Alexander. The Near East, from the perspective of someone who lived in the Roman Mediterranean, this refers to all the territory east of the Mediterranean, chiefly the Roman provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, and in a looser sense, the surrounding territories, for example, Arabia. Much more characteristic was the gradual extension of Roman direct rule. This was accomplished by absorbing a whole series of dependent kingdoms into Roman provincial territory. The Near East was full of such kingdoms. These were local kingdoms that were clients of Rome. Their rulers could be relied on to use their forces in support of Rome, and in return, Rome allowed them to exist. But by the early 2nd century, those who lay west of the Euphrates towards Roman territory had disappeared, swallowed up by Rome. Incidentally, some of these kingdoms were exceedingly wealthy. For example, Herod's kingdom yielded the equivalent of 5.4 million denarii per year, equal to over 125,000 kg of gold. The denarius was the Roman silver coin containing about 4 half gram of pure silver. In fact, except for Italy, which was not considered a province in these centuries, all the territories of the empire were organized into provinces and subject to taxation. At its peak in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the borders of Armenia and from the Sahara to the Euphrates and sometimes beyond. Given that there was no government in the modern sense to help them to run things, you may well ask how was it possible for the emperor to cope with the control and administration of such a vast diverse set of territories, with a population of some 60 million in the mid 2nd century. The answer lies in the urbanization of the empire. A great urban center that lined the shores of the Mediterranean, Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch were the biggest among them, were true bedrock of the imperial system. It was through the cities that government was able to tax the provincial countrysides, which generated much more of the wealth of the empire. What this means is that the local upper classes actively collaborated with the Roman state in administrating their own territories and raising taxes from them. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Roman political history is the dramatic shift in power between Italy and the provinces. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was the provincial upper classes who supplied most of the cadre that governed the provinces and commanded the armies. They came to form a new elite of administrators and military commanders who became much more powerful than the senatorial class because they had the backing of the emperors. As this new group emerged, the Emperor Gallienus consolidated their rise to power by excluding senators from military command. We are told that Gallienus forbade senators from serving in the army or having access to it in order to prevent control of the empire from falling into their hands. To sum up, in the late 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd centuries, the army and administration were increasingly drawn from the provinces as citizenship spread to these regions and was no longer confined to Italy. But individuals of Italian origin continued to dominate the Senate at least till the 3rd century, when senators of provincial origin became a majority. These trends reflected the general decline of Italy within the empire, both political and economic, and the rise of new elites in the wealthier and more urbanized parts of the Mediterranean, such as the south of Spain, Africa, and East. A city in the Roman sense was an urban center with its own magistrates, city council, and a territory containing villages which were under its jurisdiction. Thus, one city could not be in the territory of another city, but villages almost always were. Uh, Villages could be upgraded to the status of cities and vice versa, usually as a mark of imperial favor or the opposite. One crucial advantage of living in a city was simply that it might be better provided for during food shortages and even famines than the countryside. Dr. Galen on how Roman cities treated the countryside. The famine prevalent for many successive years in many provinces had clearly displayed, for men of any understanding, the effect of malnutrition in generating illness. The city dwellers, as it was their custom to collect and store enough grain for the whole of the next year immediately after the harvest, carried off all the wheat, barley, beans, and lentils, and left to the pigeons various kinds of pulse after taking quite a large proportion of these to the city. After consuming what was left in the course of the winter, the country people had to resort to unhealthy foods in the spring. They ate twigs and shoots of trees, and bushes and bulbs and roots of inedible plants. Public baths were a striking feature of Roman urban life. When one Iranian ruler tried to introduce them into Iran, he encountered the wrath of clergy there. Water was a sacred element, and to use it for public bathing may have seemed a desecration to them. And urban population also enjoyed a much higher level of entertainment. For example, one calendar tells us that spectacular shows filled no less than 176 days of the year. The 3rd century crisis. In the 1st and 2nd centuries were by and large a period of peace, prosperity, and economic expansion. The 3rd century brought the first major signs of internal strain. From the 230s, the empire found itself fighting on several fronts simultaneously. In Iran, a new and more aggressive dynasty emerged in 225. They called themselves the Sassanians, and within just 15 years were expanding rapidly in the direction of the Euphrates. In a famous rock inscription cut in 3 languages, Sapur I, the Iranian ruler, claimed he had annihilated a Roman army of 60,000 and even captured the eastern capital of Antioch. Meanwhile, a whole series of Germanic tribes, or rather tribal confederacies, most notably the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Goths, began to move against the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and the whole period from 233 to 280 saw repeated invasion of a whole line of provinces that stretched from the Black Sea to the Alps and southern Germany. The Romans were forced to abandon much of the territory beyond the Danube. While the emperors of this period were constantly in the field against what the Romans called barbarians, the rapid succession of emperors in 3rd century, 25 emperors in 47 years, is an obvious symptom of the strains faced by the empire in this period. Gender literacy culture. One of the more modern features of Roman society was the widespread prevalence of the nuclear family. Adult sons did not live with their families, and it was exceptional for adult brothers to share a common household. On the other hand, slaves were included in the family as the Romans understood this. By the late Republic, the 1st century BC, the typical form of marriage was one where the wife did not transfer to her husband's authority but retained full rights in the property of her natal family. While the woman's dowry went to the husband for the duration of the marriage, the woman remained a primary heir of her father and became an independent property owner on her father's death. Thus, Roman women enjoyed considerable legal rights in owning and managing property. In other words, in law, the married couple was not one financial entity but two, and the wife enjoyed complete legal independence. Divorce was relatively easy and needed no more than a notice of intent to dissolve the marriage by the either husband or wife. On the other hand, whereas males married in the late 20s or early 30s, women were married off in late teens or early 20s. So there was an age gap between husband and wife, and this would have encouraged a certain inequality. Marriages were generally arranged, and there is no doubt that women were often subject to domination by their husbands. Augustine, the great Catholic bishop who spent most of his time in North Africa, Saint Augustine was bishop of North African city of Hippo from 396 and a towering figure in the intellectual history of the church. Bishops were the most important religious figures in Christian community and often very powerful. Tells us that his mother was regularly beaten by his father and that most other wives in small towns where he grew up had similar bruises to show. Finally, fathers had substantial legal control over their children, sometimes to a shocking degree. For example, a legal power of life and death in exposing unwanted children by leaving them out in the cold to die. What about literacy? It is certain that rates of casual literacy, the use of reading and writing in everyday often trivial context, varied greatly between different parts of the empire. For example, in Pompeii, which was buried in a volcanic eruption in 79 CE, there is strong evidence of widespread casual literacy. Walls on the main streets of Pompeii often carried advertisements, and graffiti were found all over the city. By contrast, in Egypt, where hundreds of papyri survive, most formal documents, they often, such as contracts, were usually written by professional scribes, and they often tell us that X or Y is unable to read and write. But even here, literacy was certainly more widespread among certain categories, such as soldiers, army officers, and estate managers. The cultural diversity of the empire was reflected in many ways and at many levels. In the vast diversity of religious cults and local deities, the plurality of language that was spoken, the styles of dress and costume, the food people ate, their form of social organization, tribal or non tribal, even their patterns of settlement. Aramaic was the dominant language group of the Near East, at least west of the Euphrates. Coptic was spoken in Egypt, Punic and Berber in North Africa, Celtic in Spain and the Northwest, but many of these linguistic cultures were purely oral, at least until a script was invented for them. Armenian, for example, only began to be written as late as the 5th century, whereas there was already a Coptic. Coptic translation of the Bible by the middle of the 3rd century. Elsewhere, the spread of Latin displaced the written form of languages that were otherwise widespread. This happened notably with Celtic, which ceased to be written after the 1st century. Economic expansion. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbors, mines, quarries, brickyards, olive oil factories, etc. Wheat, wine, and olive oil were traded and consumed in huge quantities, and they came mainly from Spain, the Gallic provinces, North Africa, Egypt, and to a lesser extent Italy, where conditions were worst for these crops. Liquids like wine and olive oil were transported in containers called amphore. The fragments and shreds of a very large number of these survive. Monte Testaccio in Rome is said to contain the remnants of over 50 million vessels, and it has been possible for archaeologists to reconstruct the precise shapes of these containers. Tell us what they carried and say exactly where they were made by examining the clay content and matching the finds with clay pits throughout the Mediterranean. In this way, we can now say with some confidence that Spanish olive oil, to take just one example, was a vast commercial enterprise that reached its peak in the years 140 to 160. The Spanish olive oil of this period was mainly carried in container called Dressel 20. After the archaeologists who first established this form, if finds of Dressel 20 are widely scattered across sites in the Mediterranean, this suggests that Spanish olive oil circulated very widely indeed. By using such evidence, the remains of amphorae of different kinds and the distribution maps, archaeologists are able to show that Spanish producers succeeded in capturing markets for olive oil from the Italian counterparts. This would only have happened if Spanish producers supplied a better quality oil at lower prices. In other words, the big landowners from different regions competed with each other for control of the main markets for the goods they produce. The success of the Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers. Olive estates in this part of the empire dominated production through most of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Later, after 425, North African dominance was broken by the East. In the later 5th and 6th centuries, the Aegean, Southern Asia Minor, Turkey, Syria, and Palestine became major exporters of wine and olive oil, and containers from Africa saw a dramatically reduced presence on Mediterranean markets. Behind these broad movements, the prosperity of individual regions rose and fell depending on how effectively they could organize the production and transport of particular goods and on the quality of those goods. The empire included many regions that had a reputation for exceptional fertility. Campania in Italy, Sicily the Fayum in Egypt, Galilee, Bezetcum, Tunisia, southern Gaul called Gallia Narbonensis, or wealthiest parts of the empire, according to writers like Strabo and Pliny. The best kinds of wines came from Campania, Sicily, and Bizaclum. Exported large quantities of food to Rome. Galilee was densely cultivated. Every inch of the soil has been cultivated by the inhabitants, wrote the historian Josephus. And Spanish olive oil came mainly from numerous estates Fondi along the banks of the river Guadalquivir in the southern of Spain. On the other hand, large expanses of Roman territory were in the much less advanced state. For example, transhumanism was widespread in countryside of Numidia, modern Algeria. Transhumanism is the herdsman's regular annual movement between the higher mountain regions and lower lying ground in search of pasture for sheep and other flocks. As Roman estates expanded in North Africa, the pastures of those communities were in Spain were drastically reduced and their movement more tightly regulated. Even in Spain, the north was much less developed and inhabited largely by a Celtic speaking peasantry that lived in hilltop villages called Castilla. When we think of the Roman Empire, we should never forget these differences. We should also be careful not to imagine that because this was the ancient world, their forms of cultural and economic life were necessarily backward or primitive. On the contrary, diversified application of water power around the Mediterranean as well as advances in water powered milling technology, the use of hydraulic mining technique in the Spanish gold and silver mines, and the gigantic industrial scale on which those mines were worked in the first and second centuries, with levels of output that would not be reached again till the 19th century, some 1700 years later. The existence of well organized commercial and banking networks and the widespread use of money are all indicators of how much we tend to underestimate the sophistication of the Roman economy. This raises the issue of labor and the use of slavery. Controlling workers. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, and not even Christianity, when it emerged and triumphed as the state religion in the 4th century, seriously challenged the institution. It does not follow that the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy was performed by slaves. तो आज के लिए इतना ही रखते हैं। हम कल यहाँ से शुरू करेंगे कंट्रोलिंग वर्कर से, क्योंकि आज थोड़ा मेरा गला ख़राब है, इसलिए हम कल कंटिन्यू करेंगे। और आज का सेशन मैं यहीं एंड कर रही हूँ। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।